Hello, my name is Kozicki, and I welcome you to this public health series about auto accidents. I want to share some information with you that might be helpful, and I have some experts here who will also share their opinions and their expertise with you in just a moment. What I want to bring up first of all is that in the United States there are more than 250 million registered vehicles on the road. What we can expect then is a few accidents. When we look at the number of accidents in this country, there's an accident taking place about every 10 seconds. The cost is about $99 billion a year for medical and lost productivity. And with that loss comes an amount of suffering that sometimes can't be measured by dollars. So what are some of the risks that we see with accidents? Well, first of all, young people are more involved in accidents than older people. Motorcyclists are also another group that are at risk. Along with that, we have impaired drivers and distracted drivers. All these add up to the accidents that we see. I'd like to introduce my first guest, Deputy Brandon Charbonneau from the Midland County Sheriff's Department. And Brandon, why don't you tell us a little bit about your view of auto accidents based on your experience and, of course, your role as a police officer.
Okay. Not only am I a deputy with the Sheriff's Office, I'm also one of 5 accident reconstructionists with our department. So I see quite a few of the accidents, especially if it's a serious accident. I'm called out to the scene to take measurements and investigate the accident. The biggest contributor to an accident, I would say, is excessive speed, including, snowy roadways, rainy roadways, even dry roadways. A lot of people seem to exceed the speed limit, and that is the biggest cause for a crash. If it's snowy, if the speed limit says it's 55, doesn't mean you can go 55. You have to bring your speeds down and allow for the road conditions, and that's what I say is probably the biggest cause for crashes.
So if people were to just slow down just a little bit, we would probably have fewer accidents.
You'd have less. You wouldn't have none, but you'd have less. And drive, I would say, more in a defensive mode rather than an aggressive mode. And if you mix the aggressiveness with the high speeds, that's a mixture for an accident.
I was driving down one of the major expressways the other day and came across an accident. And I wasn't really sure what to do, whether to call 911 or it was a car off the side of the road, and apparently it's slid off the road. What kind of things would you recommend to people when they come across an accident?
I would say when you come across the accident, not only call 911, but if you can do it in a safe manner, stop. Stop at the accident scene, check on what I would say victims, see if there's injuries, and with that, if I'm the deputy and I get a call on the radio that there's an accident, if the passing motorist stops and checks for injuries, we can eliminate a lot of other issues involved with that. So if there's no accident, if there's no injuries, we won't need to have EMS respond, we won't need to have the fire department respond, and just with us responding on the roadway, if it's a serious accident, you have EMS traveling at a high speed, you have us traveling at a high speed, you have firemen traveling at a high speed, and if they can stop and get some information, we can eliminate a lot of people that don't need to be responding to that scene as well. But again, if it's not safe for that person to stop, don't stop, continue on, and just call us and we'll respond. But in other things I would say is, and if you do stop, make sure you're off the roadway, because if you stop on the roadway, well, we could possibly have another accident, and that's happened before.
Okay. What about if a person is involved in an accident? What are the typical expectations from the law enforcement community?
If they're involved in the accident, like I said in the previous, is if they can get off the roadway, if it's not a major accident, and they can remove their vehicle from the roadway to a parking lot or even the shoulder of the road, by all means do that.
Well, it's interesting you said that, because the other day I was behind some cars, and apparently a gal couldn't stop in time, slid and bumped the car in front of her, and they were both on their cell phones immediately calling somebody. And in the meantime, they sat there, and the cars built up, and there were probably now 20 or 30 cars behind them, each trying to figure out what was going on. Would that have made more sense for them to pull off then?
Yes.
Okay.
If they can get off the roadway, by all means do so, because you're just going to create another accident if somebody, especially if it's on an
Exactly.
expressway, then they're not going to be able to stop in time possibly, and then they can cause a crash. And a lot of the, I've been on accidents before here in Midland County working, and I'm investigating the accident, and the fire department's reducing traffic to maybe one lane, and sure enough, I hear a bang, and I look, and there's another accident because they're watching us to see what's going on. They're not paying attention, and it causes another crash. So I know it's interesting when people are passing by and they see an accident, they want to look, but you know, pay attention to the vehicle in front of you, and we can eliminate a lot of problems.
And probably slow down.
Slow down.
And be careful maneuvering through that
Through
area.
that restricted area, absolutely.
One thing that I think about sometimes when people are in accidents is sometimes people are seriously injured, and maybe they're waiting for EMS to show up or something. If a person knows first aid, should they try to apply some first aid, or should they wait?
If they know it, but if they don't, that would probably be more of a question directed towards him, but
Well, let's take that to John right now then. John, you heard my question. What should somebody do if they've had some first aid training and they come across an accident?
In an auto accident situation, unless there is immediate threat to the patient, such as severe bleeding, I wouldn't suggest that they do a lot of hands-on first aid. I would suggest that they talk to the patient, comfort the patient, assure them that help is on its way. But unless there's some real immediate need, I wouldn't recommend that they do get involved with it. There are cervical spine issues, necks, there are other issues that may not be helped by the casual first aid attempt being made. So unless the patient's bleeding profusely and they need to put pressure on it to stop it, or of course there's a problem with the vehicle, it's on fire, whatever, they need to get the person out, then you do whatever you have to do. But otherwise, I would think it would not be the best course.
Well, you, John Schaefer, have been with Mid-Michigan Health and Mid-Michigan EMS for a number of years. Now, I imagine over those years you've seen pretty much the gamut of things that have taken place. What are some of the hazards that your people face when they're out there doing their duty?
Well, a couple things, and to go back and dovetail on what the deputy said about calling in the accident, people seem to have somewhat of a misconception that when they call on their cell phone, the dispatch center is going to know exactly where they are. Now, in an ideal world, in a perfect world with the systems the way they're set up, the dispatch should know within 30 feet or so of exactly where that call came from. The problem is, how many miles down the road are you when you're finally connected to a cell tower and we track where the phone is? And secondly, we don't live in a perfect world. And if you're coming anywhere close to a county line, you may actually get a dispatch center from another county, not to mention where is the accident. So you need to be aware of your location. You know, when you're going to be calling in a 911 call on a cell phone, make sure you know where you are and are able to articulate that and tell the dispatch center where you are and what's going on. That's very important because we get the wrong resources started going to the wrong direction sometimes, and that doesn't really help a lot. So that's an important. The other thing is, as was mentioned earlier, the slowing down when you go past an accident scene. We have people go past an accident scene on the expressway still doing 70, 75 miles an hour, and that's just not appropriate. The law actually states that if there's an emergency vehicle, you are required, if possible, to pull over into the other lane and slow down as you pass the accident scene. And to the most part, people do that. When you get into nighttime and fog and bad weather, then things can really get bad. Another thing I would recommend for the accident victim is the car is probably the safest place for them to be. If they are going to get out of the car, they almost need to be on the other side of the ditch in order to be safe being out on the roadway. So the car, if it isn't dangerous to you to stay in the car, that's probably the place to be. You probably should stay in the car.
Just wait until help comes.
Wait until help comes, they get the road secured, they block the traffic flow, and what that just may mean moving it over. It doesn't necessarily mean they close the road. But those are some of the biggest dangers. Another thing I see a lot from people, not only the victims, but from bystanders as well, it was mentioned that if there's an injury, the fire departments respond, EMS responds. Well, the fire departments drive vehicles that look very similar to ambulances. And so you'll get people going, well, why aren't you moving? Why aren't you getting this patient going to the hospital? The ambulance is here. Well, it might not be the ambulance, it might be the fire rescue. And they are doing the initial care and stabilization of the patient and controlling the scene along with law enforcement. And then moving into the EMS phase where we actually are there for transport situations. So
And your people are probably specially trained. They have life-saving equipment.
certainly.
They have all the things that are necessary to make sure that that patient doesn't die from some complication there.
As best we can.
Yep.
The medical first responders coming out of the fire departments, and some of the fire departments run non-transporting EMT services in our areas, Midland and Gladwin. When they arrive, they're able to stabilize the patient. They're able to control the neck and the head for potential cervical injuries. If there's a reason to extricate the person from the vehicle prior to EMS arrival, they have the equipment and the training and the knowledge to do so safely. Obviously, they're going to take care of bleeding control. They're also going to do airway control, oxygen administration. But then when we arrive, we're able to do those more advanced steps of fluid replacement, medication if needed, cardiac monitoring, defibrillating, advanced air support, advanced airway management, and those types of things. So.
And you're connected back to the county's medical director at the emergency room?
That's correct. We have a county medical director. The emergency room acts as our online medical control. So on the scene, we pick up the radio or the cell phone, we call into the ER, and the physician there will give us whatever advice or orders or hints that we need. We operate under protocols. 99% of the time, those protocols cover the situation. But in that other 1% of the time, it's really nice to have that communication piece so we can get back
And when you're transporting the patient, I'm just curious, how does a family first learn about the accident?
Well, they may learn from law enforcement, and quite honestly, that's a bit of a problem that we see sometimes, because we may pick a patient up in Gladwin County, South Gladwin County, for example, and if Midland is the closest appropriate facility, whether that be orthopedic trauma or chest or head, which Gladwin doesn't do, it may be that we'd bring the patient directly to Midland. So Gladwin County Sheriff's Department gets involved. They call the family, say that your loved one's been in an accident, and they're taking them to the hospital. The assumption may be that they're going to the Gladwin Hospital. So when you go there and there's no one there, it creates quite a bit of concern. So the deputies on the scene are usually pretty good about saying, where are you going to be taking them?
Mm-hmm.
And then they can pass that information along. Because otherwise it gets pretty complicated with the HIPAA rules and stuff. If they call Gladwin, Gladwin can't tell them anything.
Yeah, and HIPAA is a rule that protects the confidentiality of the patient.
That's correct.
And so anybody calling in is not going to get that information.
And it also, in some instances, hinders the ability to provide service to the community, not to the patient, but to the family, to the others. So, yeah, it can be a little tricky sometimes.
Now, one thing I wanted to ask maybe both of you, because you've seen it both probably as a driver but also as a first responder, is when you're coming to an intersection and your lights are going and you've got the siren going, what should people be doing? Where should they go in their cars?
Well, I'll speak to, the Michigan law says that people will pull to the right and stop.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Doesn't say slow down, it doesn't say stop in the middle of the lane. It says pull to the right and stop. And so if they do that, then things work pretty smoothly. When we're going through an intersection, the law also gives us the, I don't remember what the term is, but we have the ability to go through a red light, through a stop sign, but we don't lose the liability of doing so.
Absolutely.
Oh,
So
really?
when we come, if I'm sure he does, all of us do, but if we're coming to an intersection and my light is red, I'll stop. And I'll make sure the vehicles that are
So
crossing
this isn't
me
like
stop.
Hollywood where they just blow
No,
through
it's,
them?
it's
No.
not Hollywood. So I'll stop and I'll make sure
Yeah.
everybody's stopped, and then I'll go through the intersection.
Now, sometimes somebody might get caught out in that left lane when they suddenly realize there's an ambulance behind them or police car. They shouldn't try to scoot across to the right side at that point, should they?
It makes it very complicated because we have a rule that says you never pass a car on the right.
Okay.
That's just a dangerous thing to do because they're liable to do that. They're liable to dive to the right. So it makes it really hard. Sometimes it happens. They're pulling over to a left-hand turn lane, and we're trying to go straight through an intersection, and then we've got cars on both sides of us, and it really becomes scary. At that point, we have to slow down almost to barely moving so that if they make a change of plans, we can react to it.
Yeah.
Because it's very dangerous when we have to pass a car on the right.
the
You
right.
don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah. I've never seen an ambulance lock up their brakes, but it probably takes a distance to stop those. right?
They weigh about 12,000 pounds, and they do not stop on a dime,
Yeah.
so you have to be prepared. The deputy mentioned a defensive driving, and that certainly is the key. When I first got into the ambulance business, they were doing more of an evasive driver's training issue, like a law enforcement chase type training, which makes no sense at all from an EMS perspective. And in fact, I'm not sure they really promote that a lot for law enforcement
No,
other
they
than
don't.
for that segment.
Okay.
But defensive driving, that's where all the training is today, is how do you approach an intersection? What do you have to be careful of?
Well, we're going to talk with Counselor Attorney Dan Iacco, who's going to tell us about the law and tell us what the rights are in Michigan and how Michigan law works when it comes to accidents. Thank you, Dan.
You bet. We see the victims of auto accidents after the aftermath, obviously, and after things have settled down. And usually at that point, people are concerned about how are my medical expenses going to be paid? What am I going to do for income if I'm injured and can't work for a certain period of time? How am I going to support my family? Those are probably the most common questions that we get immediately after the aftermath of a motor vehicle accident. Michigan is a compulsory no-fault state. That means that you have to have no-fault insurance if you own and drive a motor vehicle on the public roadway. If you don't, there are some penalties. And the officer could tell you what those penalties are, but you can be cited for a misdemeanor if you don't have insurance. There are an awful lot of motor vehicles out there that are uninsured. But another penalty if you don't have the compulsory insurance is that you lose your right to all of the benefits that the very, very compassionate no-fault law allows people who are injured in motor vehicle accidents. Those benefits would be the right to have all of your medical expenses paid without limit on time, without a limit on amount. That no-fault benefit is there to provide quick payment so that you can get the medical care that you need. The old system required you to sue the at-fault driver, which would put you in court. It would be very costly, and it would take a lot of time. So that system was changed in 1973 to the no-fault system we have today. So all of your medical expenses are going to be taken care of that arise out of the motor vehicle accident. You're going to have your wage loss paid. You're going to get 85% of the wages or income that you've lost as a result of your injuries connected to the motor vehicle accident. And you're also entitled to some replacement services where if you're injured and you have to have somebody provide services around the house, shoveling snow this time of year, cutting your grass, lawn work, housework, all of those things are provided by other people. It can be people in the house. It can be your spouse. It could be your children. They're entitled up to $20 per day under the Michigan no-fault law. So those are the three basic benefits that you're entitled to. You've paid your premiums for those benefits. They're required by law to be paid if you can provide the proof that you've incurred these losses.
Now, when people have a claim or they're injured and there's some dispute that takes place afterwards. How does the legal community handle those things?
Well, in any motor vehicle accident, there may be two claims that arise out of them. One is for the benefits that you get from your own insurance policy. Again, Michigan is a no-fault state. Fault doesn't even enter into the equation. You get those benefits from your own policy. Even if you were hit by a drunk driver, those benefits would come from your own policy. The other claim, though, is a claim for injury, pain, suffering, impairment, loss of use, those kinds of things. That's a separate claim, and that is a claim where you do need to show that you were not at fault and that the accident was caused by the operation of a vehicle negligently. There usually can be disputes that arise out of that context. And if that's the situation, then you should contact a lawyer to at least investigate and explore whether that claim has merit. Now, Michigan does not allow you to make a claim and get recovery of damages in every case. You have to have something more than bumps and contusions and bruises and that type of thing. You have to meet a certain threshold, we call it, of injury. And so that weeds out the cases where there's minor injury and somebody's trying to profit from not very serious injuries. And judges can throw cases out if they feel that the injuries are not substantial enough to be compensated under the Michigan law. So that's when you get into a situation where it may require a lawyer, it may require a lawsuit.
When a lawyer does get involved in a matter like that, it probably ends up being a situation where there's depositions and experts involved and those kinds of things. Is that what happens?
Right. The chronology of a claim, if somebody were to come to me, I would do whatever I can to try and resolve it without a lawsuit. It's much less time consuming and it's a lot less costly for the client. So if I can do it that way, I'm going to do it that way. But there are times where we have to have the matter put into a court of law so that a jury can decide if there was fault and whether the injuries meet the threshold requirement and what a verdict should be given the extent and nature of the injuries. So once the lawsuit is filed, usually in a circuit court, and in Midland it'd be Midland County Circuit Court, then there's a discovery phase, and that's what you're referring to, where we do depositions, we sit down with witnesses, with parties, the attorneys involved will ask questions, the witnesses are all under oath. The officer has had his deposition, I'm sure, taken in many civil cases where there's been a motor vehicle accident, and he's asked questions about what he saw at the scene and those types of things. And then eventually the case works its way toward a trial. The case may settle at some point in that course. If it doesn't settle, then we have a jury to decide those issues.
Now, is there a limit, and I think there is, on the length of time that a person can be paid lost wages?
There are. Medical expense reimbursement is unlimited. Lost wages, 3 years maximum from the date of the motor vehicle accident. There's also a 3-year maximum for replacement services. If someone is killed in a motor vehicle accident, then the dependents of that person are also entitled to those wage loss, or what we call loss of things of economic value, and that's also capped at 3 years. But those caps only apply to wage loss and the replacement services.
Okay. And if a person is going to be disabled for more than 3 years, they would apply for Social Security disability?
They certainly could do that. If they meet the disability requirement for Social Security disability, they could apply, and if they're awarded those benefits, those could go on for virtually a lifetime, at least until you switch over to regular retirement age.
Okay. Well, that's good. Now, as we're coming to the close here, I just wanted to point out, first of all, that the legal system is one reason that we're able to do many things without taking it out on each other, and I think it's a valuable service, and particularly when we think about how many accidents are taking place. It's amazing that we don't have more problems. I think in Michigan, anyways, it seems as if There's a good system here. If there's anything that you think you can add from the discussion here, I'll open up the floor for your comments or thoughts.
I just say, like I said, keep the speeds down. Speed is the biggest, the killer we have out there, especially on some of the roads we have here in Midland County. M20 is a bad road, and it's easy on that roadway to, I would say, accidentally get your speed up. You know, you're not paying attention. You could be talking to somebody. It's a long stretch from one end of the county to the other, and that is one of our major roads, and that speed's a big contributor to that roadway. So that's about all I can say.
And I think Michigan passed a law that said that basically people can't text anymore.
Absolutely.
So it's another issue.
Yep, concentration. You just got to be paying attention to the roadway. Not only texting, but even talking on the phone. You'll have people that, and I've seen it in my patrol car, some people drive extremely slow because they're talking on the phone. If the speed limit's 45, they're driving 40 in the passing lane, and that's a problem on the roadway. You know, because the speed limit's posted at 55. If you have somebody coming up behind you at 55, they're slamming on the brakes, and it's chain reaction. There's car accidents.
And for those people who can't remember from their driver's training course, the right lane is the slow lane and the left lane's the passing lane, right?
That's the technical term for it, but people call the left lane the fast lane and the right lane the slow lane. But
Okay. John, any closing thoughts?
Just that idea of distraction. There have been studies done that show talking on the cell phone has a very similar distractive nature as alcohol and intoxication. It's just we take it so much for granted. And people say, well, I don't want to waste the 2-hour drive. Well, your job is to drive.
Huh, okay.
When you're driving a car, that is your job. It's not setting up meetings and
No multitasking.
talking on the phone, not
Yeah.
while you're driving. It's
All
just
right.
not a good plan.
Okay. Attorney?
2 points. One is I always recommend that you talk with your agent, make sure you have uninsured motorist coverage, because I think statistically about 12 to 18% of the drivers out on the roadway do not have insurance.
Wow.
And if you're struck by one of them and you want to make a claim and they don't have insurance and you don't have uninsured motorist coverage, you're out of luck, other than your medical replacement services and wage loss. And the other thing is underinsurance, which is insurance that you purchase that steps into the shoes of the other vehicle that has insurance, but maybe a minimum of 20/40, which is the least you can have in this state.
So a little extra insurance for your benefit.
Yeah, a little extra, and it's very cheap.
Okay. Well, we're going to wrap up here, and I appreciate your watching us. This is the first in the series called The Accident, and we're looking at how the law treats the accident. We'll also be looking in future series here, talking with survivors and with medical people. So thank you, and this has been a public service for your benefit.